The morning Alice Lawson buried her husband, the sky over Redemption Creek. Texas was the color of a bruise, and she made herself a promise standing at that grave that she would never ask a single soul in that town for anything ever again. It was the spring of 1878, and the red dirt of West Texas had already swallowed more dreams than Alice cared to count. Robert Lawson had been a good man, a quiet man who spoke more to his horses than to other people, and he had died the way so many men died in that country, not by the gun, not by the hand of another, but by the slow and merciless cruelty of a fever that came on a Wednesday and took him by the following Sunday. He was 31 years old, and Alice was 28, and they had a son named Eli who was 6 and a daughter named Clara who was 4. And now they had 40 acres of scrub land west of town with a half-finished fence line, a leaking roof, and a smokehouse that needed a new door. The women of Redemption Creek had brought casseroles and condolences. The men had removed their hats and said they were sorry for her loss. Old Ben Cassidy, who owned the general store, had told her with a kindness that felt almost like pity that she could have until the end of summer to settle Robert's account before he would need to collect. The Reverend had said God's plan was mysterious. The banker, Mr. Holt, had ridden out 2 days after the funeral to tell her very gently that the note on the property was due in 14 months and that he was confident she would find a way to manage things. Not a single one of them had offered her their hands, and Alice had looked at each of them with those dark, steady eyes of hers, thanked them for coming, and shut the door. She was not bitter. That was the remarkable thing about Alice Lawson that the people of Redemption Creek could not quite wrap their minds around. She was not bitter, and she was not broken, and she did not waste a single morning weeping when there was work to be done. She wept in the evenings, after Eli and Clara were asleep, sitting on the porch with Robert's old coat across her shoulders, looking out at the dark shape of the land that was hers and theirs, and would stay that way if she had anything to say about it. She fixed the roof herself. She climbed up there with a hammer and a bucket of tar and new shingles she had traded 2 of Robert's good shirts for at Cassidy's store, and she worked in the June heat until the leak was sealed. Eli handed things up to her from the base of the ladder, very serious and very solemn in the way that 6-year-old boys become solemn when they understand something has changed in the world, even if they cannot name the exact thing that has changed. She repaired the fence line, section by section, post by post, stretching wire until her palms were striped with thin red lines that she wrapped with strips of cloth torn from an old petticoat. She planted a kitchen garden and an expanded vegetable patch, and she turned over soil that had never been turned before, working until her back screamed, and then working a little more after that. She traded eggs at the store. She took in mending for 2 of the ranch wives farther out. She made soap and sold it. She made candles. She did everything that needed doing, and she did it without complaint, and she did it without asking. The town watched her with a mixture of admiration and something that was not quite guilt but lived in the same neighborhood. There were those who said she was too proud. There were those who said she was foolish. There were those who said she would crack before the first winter and come around asking for help then. There were a few, mostly women, who said Alice Lawson was the most capable person in Redemption Creek, and that the town should be ashamed of itself for standing back and watching her work herself to the bone. But saying a thing and doing a thing were 2 different operations entirely, and for the most part, the town kept its comfortable distance. Homer Thatcher had been watching too. He was not a man who announced himself. He was 34 years old, and he had been ranching his family spread 5 miles north of town for the better part of 12 years, ever since his father's hands had gotten too stiff for the work, and his mother had taken ill, and he had come back from a cattle drive in Kansas to take over. The Thatcher Ranch ran about 300 head and employed 2 permanent hands, a Mexican vaquero named Domingo and a young man from Missouri called Patterson. And it was by no means a grand operation, but it was a solid one. And Homer ran it the way he ran everything, steadily, quietly, without much fuss. He had known Robert Lawson the way men in small territories know each other, which is to say well enough to nod and share a drink at the saloon and talk about weather and cattle prices, but not well enough to know the private texture of the man's life. He had attended the funeral because it was the right thing to do, and he had stood at the back near the cottonwood trees, and he had watched Alice Lawson stand at that grave in her black dress with her two small children flanking her, and something had moved through him that he could not name. It was not pity. He was sure of that. It was something closer to recognition, though he could not have said what exactly he was recognizing. He had ridden home after the funeral and gone back to his work and told himself it was not his place to interfere. She had family of a kind, neighbors of a kind. She would find her footing. But the weeks passed and the summer deepened, and he would see her occasionally in town, at Cassidy's store or at the post office, always purposeful, always moving with that particular efficiency of someone who has calculated exactly how much time they can spend on any one thing. And each time he saw her, he felt that unnamed thing move through him again, and he did not act on it. He was a man who thought before he acted. Sometimes he thought too long. By July, half the town knew that Alice Lawson had fixed her own roof and mended her own fence and was selling eggs and soap and taking in sewing work. And the stories went around with that mixture of admiration and mild discomfort. And Homer heard them all and felt the unnamed thing grow heavier. And still he did not ride over. What stopped him, if he was honest with himself? And Homer Thatcher was, by nature and by habit, a deeply honest man, was that he did not know how. He did not know how to ride up to a widow's property and offer help without it looking like charity, which it would be, and which she would refuse, because anyone paying the slightest attention to Alice Lawson could see that she would walk barefoot across broken glass before she accepted charity from anyone. He did not know how to make an offer that was something other than charity. He did not know what to say, so he told himself to wait until he could figure it out. August came and the heat turned savage, the kind of heat that made the air above the road shimmer like water and killed anything that wasn't tough enough to be stubborn. Alice Lawson kept working. Homer heard from Domingo, who had a cousin who lived near the Lawson property, that she had dug an extension to her root cellar by hand, spending 2 weeks on it, going down into the hard earth with a pick and a shovel while the children played nearby. By hand. Homer had sat with that information for a full evening, and then gone to bed and laid there looking at the ceiling with the thing in his chest that was not pity and not guilt, though it had borrowed something from both of them. September came with a slight relief in the temperature and a county fair in the town of Millbrook, 12 miles east, and Alice Lawson came to it with her children, and with a table of goods she had made the soap, some jam she had put up, some embroidered handkerchiefs, and she sold everything she had brought and bought a bolt of cloth and some nails, and a small quantity of salt pork with the proceeds. Homer watched her from across the fairground without quite meaning to, noticing the way she handled the transactions with a brisk confidence that left no room for anyone to feel sorry for her, noticing the way she laughed when Clara tugged at her skirt and pointed at a horse, noticing the way Eli stayed close to her side like a small, serious sentry. He started toward her twice and stopped twice. He bought a sarsaparilla at the drink stand and argued with himself while he drank it. She looked up once and their eyes met across the distance, and she gave him a small, polite nod of acknowledgement, the kind she gave everyone, and then looked away, and Homer stood there holding his empty glass and feeling like the largest fool in West Texas. When he finally got his nerve to walk over, she was packing up her table with Eli's help, and he came up and took off his hat and said, "Mrs. Lawson, good afternoon." She looked at him with those steady dark eyes and said, "Mr. Thatcher." "Good afternoon." "It was a good fare," he said, which was a completely useless thing to say, and he knew it the moment it left his mouth. "It was," she agreed, folding a piece of cloth with neat, practiced motions. "I heard you put up preserves this year," he said. "My mother used to say that putting up preserves was the hardest and most honest work there was." Something shifted very slightly in her expression, not a smile exactly, but a softening. "Your mother sounds like a sensible woman," she said. "She was," he said. "She passed 3 years ago." "I'm sorry," Alice said, and she meant it, and he could hear that she meant it. "I was going to," he started, and then stopped, because what he had been going to say was that he had been thinking of riding over to her place to see if there was anything that needed doing, and even saying it in his head, it sounded clumsy and patronizing, and he abandoned it. "You were going to?" she prompted, looking at him with a mild patience that suggested she had plenty of other things she could be doing. "Nothing," he said. "I hope the rest of the season treats you well, Mrs. Lawson." "Thank you," she said. "And you, Mr. Thatcher." He walked away and spent the entire 12-mile ride back to his ranch calling himself every variety of fool he could think of. October arrived, and with it the first fingers of cold from the northwest, and Alice Lawson took on a new enterprise. She had located, through some negotiation that people only heard about after the fact, an arrangement with a rancher named Sutter 20 miles south who needed someone to cure and treat hides. Sutter sent the hides. She treated them according to a process she had learned from a Comanche woman named Lupe who had lived near the town some years earlier, and Sutter sent payment by way of a rider who came twice a month. It was not a fortune, but it was steady, and it meant she could keep up with Cassidy's account and put a little against the bank note. Homer heard about this from Patterson, who heard it from the rider who brought the hides, and he sat on his porch in the October evening and looked at the north stars coming out and felt something shift in him that was more decisive than anything he had felt in months. He was wasting time. That was the simple truth of it. He was wasting time, and she was out there working herself to dust, and he was sitting on his porch being cautious. And caution in this case was just a polished word for cowardice. He decided he would ride over the next morning. He would ride over and he would not offer her charity. He would not say he was sorry for her loss because that had been said by everyone and meant less each time it was said. He would say something true instead. He would figure out what that was on the ride over. He barely slept. In the morning, he put on a clean shirt and his good hat, which he immediately felt self-conscious about, and nearly exchanged for his working hat before deciding the good hat was fine. And he saddled his bay mare named Grace and rode south toward the Lawson property in the cool October morning, with the sky that specific shade of clear, brilliant blue that only happened in West Texas in the autumn. He arrived at the property around mid-morning and found Alice in the yard with a wooden frame she was assembling, something he couldn't quite identify. She had her hair pinned back under a wide-brimmed hat, and she was wearing her working clothes, a heavy cotton skirt and a canvas jacket, and she was drilling a hole in one of the frame's joints with a hand brace and bit, working it with steady, methodical turns of her wrist. She looked up when she heard Grace's hooves, and her expression went through a brief, unguarded moment of surprise before settling back into its customary composure. "Mr. Thatcher," she said. He dismounted and tied Grace to the post by the gate and walked over, hat in hand. "Mrs. Lawson," he said. "Good morning." "Good morning," she said. She glanced at the frame and then back at him. "I'm not sure what brings you out this way, but I'm afraid I can't stop what I'm doing just now. If you need to say something, you'll have to say it while I work." "That's fine," he said. "What are you building?" "A drying frame for the hides," she said, returning to the hand brace. "The one Sutter sent with the first batch is too small. I'm building a better one." "Mind if I hold that steady while you drill?" She looked at him for a moment. He held her gaze and did not look away. "If you like," she said, which was as close to yes as he suspected she generally got with strangers. He crouched down and held the joint steady with both hands, and she drilled, and they worked in silence for a few minutes, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that happens between two people who are both at ease with work and with the natural sounds of morning, the wind through the dry grass, the distant sound of the children who were somewhere out of sight. "I owe you something," he said finally. She stopped drilling and looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean I should have ridden over sooner," he said. "I should have ridden over in June when you were fixing the roof and offered to help, not out of pity, Because it was the right thing to do, and because I don't have a better reason than that, Mrs. Lawson. I just should have come sooner and I didn't." She was quiet for a moment. He could not read her expression exactly. There was something in it that might have been surprise or might have been something older than surprise. "I wouldn't have let you help," she said. "I know," he said. "But I still should have offered. I'm sorry it took me this long to come and say that." The silence that followed was different from the first one. It had something in it, some new weight, some new quality that he felt without being able to name it, which was becoming a pattern where Alice Lawson was concerned. "That's an honest thing to say," she said at last. "Most people say they're sorry for my loss. You're the first person to say they're sorry for their own lapse." She looked at the frame. "Hold it steady again." He held it steady, and she drilled, and they worked through the morning together. Him holding and steadying and fetching what she needed. Her directing with a minimum of words and a maximum of precision. And by noon they had the drying frame assembled and standing in the yard, and it was a good solid piece of work. Alice stood back and looked at it with her hands on her hips and a satisfaction in her face that Homer found, privately and powerfully, the most beautiful thing he had seen in a long time. "Thank you," she said. "You're a good hand." "I have my moments," he said. She looked at him then with the closest thing to a real smile she had shown him, just a brief curve at the corner of her mouth, and said, "Do you want coffee, Mr. Thatcher? I have it on the stove." He accepted the coffee. They sat on the porch with their cups, and Eli came running from somewhere behind the smokehouse with a lizard in his fist that he was very proud of, and Clara came behind him at a more dignified pace, and both children stopped short when they saw the stranger on the porch. "This is Mr. Thatcher," Alice said. "He helped me build the frame." Eli looked at Homer with the direct, unfiltered assessment of a 6-year-old. "Can you rope?" he asked. "Eli," Alice said, with a mild warning in her voice. "I can rope," Homer said. "Not as good as some, better than others." Eli considered this seriously. "Pa could rope anything," he said. "I expect he could," Homer said, and did not look away from the boy, and did not make it awkward. And Eli seemed satisfied with this response and went to show his lizard to his mother, who expressed appropriate admiration. Homer rode home that afternoon with something lighter in his chest than had been there in recent memory. He did not know what it was yet, or what it would become, but it felt like the beginning of something he did not want to rush. He rode back the following week with no particular pretense. He simply came and asked if there was anything that needed doing that 2 sets of hands could accomplish better than one. Alice looked at him for a long moment and then said that the smokehouse door was still warped and she hadn't gotten to it yet. He fixed the smokehouse door. She made lunch and they ate it with the children at the kitchen table and talked about the winter prospects and the price of cattle and the quality of the November sky, which had turned dramatic and wide with high-moving cloud formations. It became a pattern. He came on Thursdays, which seemed to have been established by some unspoken mutual agreement that neither of them ever actually made aloud. He came, and there was always something that needed doing, and he did it, and always she fed him a meal, and always they talked, and the conversations got longer and moved further inward, the way conversations do when two people who are naturally reserved begin to trust each other's company. She told him about growing up in Missouri, in a town on the Mississippi that bore no resemblance to West Texas, and how she had come out here with Robert when she was 22 because he had wanted land of his own, and this was where land could still be had. She told him about the first year, which had been genuinely hard in ways she had not been prepared for, and how Robert had been better suited to this country than she had been at first, and how she had eventually grown into it, grown into the particular discipline and dignity of life in a hard landscape. Homer told her about Kansas, about the years he had spent on cattle drives before his father's hands gave out, about the vastness of the plains that made a man feel simultaneously small and somehow more precisely himself than anywhere else. He told her about his mother, who had been a schoolteacher before she married, and who had read aloud to him and his sister from novels and poetry on winter evenings, and how he still kept a few of her books on a shelf in his bedroom and sometimes read a page or two at night. Alice looked at him when he said this with an expression he was learning to read as genuine interest. "Which books?" she asked. He told her, and she knew two of them and had opinions about one of them, and they had a debate about the merits of a particular character in a particular novel that became the most enjoyable conversation Homer had had in years, possibly ever, and afterward he rode home in the dark with the stars blazing overhead and Grace moving steadily beneath him. And he knew what the unnamed thing was. He knew exactly what it was, and had probably known it for longer than he was comfortable admitting. He spent November being very careful about it. He was careful because she was still a widow in the first year of her widowhood, and he had enough respect for her, and for Robert Lawson's memory, and for the children who were still learning how to carry the weight of their father's absence to not rush any of this. He did not press. He came on Thursdays and he helped and they talked, and he was careful to keep himself within the proper boundaries that the situation required. But care and feeling do not always agree with each other, and there were moments when the feeling was louder than the care. There was an afternoon in early December when the first real cold had come down hard, and Alice was trying to get the water pump to work, because the handle mechanism had seized, and Homer had come over to find her on her knees in the frozen mud beside it, working at the mechanism with freezing hands and a focused ferocity that was entirely characteristic of her. He had told her to step back and let him look at it, and she had said she nearly had it, and he had said he could see what was wrong and it would take a tool she didn't have, and she had looked up at him with cold reddened cheeks and frustrated eyes, and he had reached down and offered her his hand to help her up from her knees. She had taken it, that was all. She took his hand and he pulled her up and she was steady on her feet before he thought to let go, and he held her hand for one beat longer than necessary, and she did not pull it away for that one beat longer, and they stood in the frozen yard looking at each other with their breath misting between them, and then she said quietly, "Thank you," and went inside to warm her hands. And Homer crouched down to deal with the pump mechanism and felt his heart doing things it had no business doing in the middle of a December morning. He fixed the pump. He always fixed what needed fixing. That was the one thing he was very sure of. Christmas came and Homer brought a small gift for each of the children, a carved wooden horse for Eli that he had made himself over several evenings, and a cloth doll in a red dress for Clara that he had, with considerable embarrassment, ordered from the catalog at Cassidy's store, and paid more than he should have. He also brought Alice a book, one of the ones they had talked about, a copy of a novel she had mentioned she had never gotten to read, which Cassidy had sourced through the same catalog with a 6-week wait that Homer had been quietly tracking since October. He had not been sure, in the days leading up to Christmas, whether the book was too personal a gift for where they were. He had almost replaced it with something more practical, a good pair of gloves perhaps, or a jar of good coffee. But he had thought about it long enough and arrived at the conclusion that the book was right, not because he was trying to signal something, but because it was genuinely the most thoughtful thing he could give her, and Alice Lawson deserved thoughtful. When she opened it, she went very still. She turned it over in her hands and looked at the cover and then looked at him. "How did you know?" she asked, meaning how did he remember the title from a conversation they had had almost 2 months ago. "I pay attention," he said. She held the book against her chest briefly, which was the most unself-conscious gesture he had ever seen her make, and said, "This is a fine Christmas gift, Mr. Thatcher. Thank you." "Homer," he said. He had not planned to say it, but he said it plainly and simply. "If you're willing, I think we've been acquainted long enough." She looked at him for a moment and something moved through her eyes, something warm and considered and not entirely steady. "Homer," she said, testing the word. "Then you should call me Alice." "Alice," he said, and felt the word settle somewhere in him like something that had been displaced for a long time finally finding its right place. The new year of 1879 came in cold and clear, and Homer Thatcher arrived on the first Thursday of it with a purpose he had not announced in advance. He had decided, over the long, thoughtful days between Christmas and the New Year, that there were practical things he could do for Alice's property that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with sense, and he was going to propose them as practical arrangements and let her decide. He proposed that he and Domingo spend 3 days helping her reinforce the barn, which was in genuine danger of losing its north wall to the next serious windstorm. He proposed this as a trade. He needed help mending a stretch of fence on his property's south boundary, and Alice had mentioned she was a competent hand with wire and post. A trade was not charity. A trade was a transaction between equals. Alice listened to the proposal with her arms crossed and her head slightly tilted, which Homer was learning was her thinking posture, and then she said, "3 days of 2 men on the barn for 1 day of me on your fence line doesn't balance." "My fence line is longer than it sounds," he said. "2 days on your fence," she said. "Then it balances." "Done," he said, and they shook hands on it, which was also more charged than a handshake between neighbors strictly needed to be, and they both were aware of it, and neither of them remarked on it. Domingo came with Homer, and the 3 of them worked on the barn for 3 days. And Domingo was a cheerful and capable man, who made Alice laugh more in 3 days than Homer had managed in 3 months, which Homer noted with something that was entirely, completely, and ridiculously like jealousy, before he reminded himself that Domingo was happily married to a woman in town and had 4 children and was simply a sociable person. Alice's 2 days on Homer's fence line came the following week, and she worked with a competence and a pace that earned a genuine nod of respect from Domingo, who did not give those out carelessly. February arrived and brought with it a slow week of rain that turned everything to mud and kept everyone indoors more than usual. And on a rainy Thursday, Homer came anyway, and they sat inside with coffee, and the children and Homer read, aloud from the book he had given Alice at Christmas, while Clara fell asleep on the rug and Eli listened with the intense concentration of a child who wants to prove he is old enough for grown-up stories. And Alice sat across the table with her mending and the firelight on her face, and Homer read and occasionally looked up at her, and felt the kind of peace that he had not felt in a very long time. After the children were in bed, she refilled his coffee and they sat together by the fire in the comfortable quiet, and Alice said, without looking at him, "You have been very kind to us, Homer." "I've been here because I wanted to be here," he said, which was truer than being kind, and she glanced at him then and away again. "I know that," she said. "That's what makes it genuine." There was a silence in which the fire made soft sounds and the rain moved across the roof, and then Alice said, in a voice that was careful and also, beneath the care, a little afraid, "I don't quite know what we are doing." "Neither do I," he said. "Exactly." She turned to look at him directly. "Tell me what you think we might be doing," she said. "Not exactly, approximately." Homer looked at the fire and then at her and said, "I think approximately. I have been falling in love with you since October, and I think I have been trying to be decent about it because I did not want to press you when you were still grieving, and because I am very aware that you are a woman who does not need anything from anyone, which is something I admire about you, and also something that makes it difficult to know how to offer you the one thing I actually have to offer." The room was very quiet. Alice set her mending down on the table with a care that seemed deliberate, a way of buying herself a moment. "What do you have to offer?" she asked, and her voice was quiet and serious and not unkind. "Myself," he said, "which I will admit is not a grand thing. I have a ranch that runs adequately. I have my father's horse and my mother's books. I am not particularly clever or particularly exciting. But I am steady, and I mean what I say, and I have spent 4 months watching you work harder than anyone I have ever known, and thinking that you deserve someone who would show up, which I have been trying to do in the only way I knew how without being presumptuous." Alice was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Homer began to rearrange his expectations inward. Then she said, "Robert has been gone 8 months. "I know," he said. People would talk, she said. People talk regardless, he said. We could give them something good to talk about. She looked at him then, and the something in her eyes was warm and a little luminous in the firelight, and she said, I am not a woman who falls easily. I know that too, he said. I'm not asking you to fall easily. I'm asking you to consider falling at all. She looked at her hands in her lap and then back at him. I have been considering it, she said quietly, since November, if you want the honest version. Homer let out a breath he did not know he had been holding. That's a good honest version, he said. She smiled then, really smiled, not the brief curve he had seen before, but a full, genuine, unguarded smile that did things to the room, and a Homer that he suspected would take considerable time to recover from. You should come for Sunday dinner, she said. Not as a neighbor who comes on Thursdays to fix things, as something else. We can see how it sits. I'll be here, he said. He rode home in the February rain with his heart doing things a 34-year-old man's heart had no right to do, and he was smiling in the dark in the rain on a cold Texas road, which was possibly the most undignified and also the most magnificent he had felt in his adult life. Sunday dinner was quieter than Thursdays because there was no project to anchor to and no task to organize around, only the business of sitting together at a table with children and food and conversation, which felt more intimate and more loaded with implication than any amount of fence-mending had. Alice had made a roast that was far better than its ingredients strictly warranted, because she was the kind of cook who extracted excellence from whatever was available, and Homer ate 2 portions and complimented her in terms that made Eli look at him with renewed assessment. After dinner, Eli asked Homer to come outside and see something he had found behind the barn, which turned out to be a large, flat, smooth stone that Eli was deeply proud of, and intended to use for some project he described in detail that Homer listened to with complete seriousness and offered several practical suggestions for. Clara sat on Homer's boot while he stood talking to Eli and held onto his pant leg, which was the sort of thing a very small child does without knowing it means anything, and Homer looked down at her and felt something large and soft move through him. Alice was watching from the porch. When he looked over at her, she did not look away, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the yard in the thin winter light, and what passed between them in that look was something that did not require any words and would have been diminished by them. March came and the land began to soften, and the wildflowers that grew along the creek bed started to come up, the first pale yellow ones, and Homer and Alice took a long walk along the creek one Sunday afternoon, while Eli ran ahead and Clara picked every flower she could reach, and Homer and Alice walked side by side close enough that the backs of their hands brushed occasionally, and eventually he turned his hand over and she put hers in it. And they walked like that the rest of the way along the creek without remarking on it. It was the kind of courting that was conducted in the open, without secrets, because Alice was a practical woman and a dignified one, and she saw no reason to be clandestine about something she had decided was right. She was also keenly aware of what the town thought and felt, and she had the particular independence of a woman who does not care what the town thinks, and the particular pride of a woman who wants to demonstrate that independence as publicly as possible. And so, when Homer came on Sundays and they walked together or sat on the porch together in the improving weather, she did not hide it from anyone who happened to pass on the road. Cassidy noticed and made a remark to his wife that was mostly warm and only slightly shaded with the lingering discomfort of a man who had offered credit instead of help, and was now watching someone else do the better thing. The Reverend said something at Sunday service about spring being a time of renewal that everyone understood was pointed vaguely in Alice's direction, and it was not unkindly meant. The women who had brought casseroles had more complex feelings, which they discussed among themselves with varying degrees of generosity. Homer was aware of all of this in the way a man is aware of weather. He noted it. He accounted for it. He did not let it alter his direction. April was warm and long and beautiful, and Homer was at Alice's property more often now, not just Sundays, but also some evenings after his own work was done, when he would ride over in the cool of the day and sit with her on the porch while the children played in the yard in the last of the light. They talked about everything and nothing in the way people do when talking itself has become the pleasure, and the subject is almost secondary. She told him things she had not told anyone, about the specific particular loneliness of that first year with Robert, before she had found her footing and her confidence, when the land had seemed hostile and incomprehensible, and she had cried at night and smiled in the mornings, and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake coming here. He told her about the years after his mother died, when the ranch had felt very large and very empty, and he had worked until he was too tired to feel it, which he now understood was not a solution so much as a postponement. "You never thought of finding someone?" she asked once on an April evening when the sky was going amber and rose and the children had been called in and it was just the two of them on the porch. "I thought of it," he said. "I wasn't particularly sure where to start. The women in Redemption Creek are," he paused, searching for the diplomatic version. "Spoken for mostly," Alice said. "Mostly," he agreed. "And the ones who aren't, I didn't," he stopped again. "They weren't the right ones," she said simply, which was simpler and more true than what he had been trying to say. "No," he said, "they weren't." She was looking at the sunset. He was looking at her and had been for a while, and he thought that the particular way the light fell across her face at this moment was the kind of thing a man could think about for the rest of his life without running out of interest in it. "Alice," he said. She turned and looked at him. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know you can take as long as you need to answer it." She waited, her dark eyes steady and clear. "I would like to marry you," he said. "Not because you need help, because you have made it profoundly clear that you do not need anyone's help, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to pay. I want to marry you because you are the most honest, capable, brave, and genuinely fine person I have encountered in my life, and because you laugh at the right moments and argue when you disagree and work until the work is done, and because I have been happier in the last 6 months than I was in the 6 years before them, and all of the difference is you." Alice was very quiet. He continued, because he had thought about this, and there was more he needed to say. "I know Robert is not very far behind you," he said. "I know you are still carrying that. I am not asking you to put it down. I am asking if there is room beside it for what I'm offering." She sat with what he had said for a long moment. The evening sounds came and went around them, a mockingbird somewhere, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft percussion of the wind through the new spring grass. Then she said, "You said in February you were not a particularly clever man. I want to correct that because that was a very clever speech." "It wasn't a speech," he said. "It was the truth." "I know," she said. "That's what makes it clever." She looked at her hands and then at him, and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears but was close enough to their family to be recognizable. "Yes," she said. "Homer, yes." He did not do anything dramatic. He reached over and took her hand and held it, and they sat together in the last of the April evening, and that was entirely enough. They were married in June of 1879, on a warm Saturday morning in the small church in Redemption Creek, with Eli in his best suit looking both proud and slightly mortified in the way of 8-year-old boys at ceremonies, and Clara in a white dress Alice had made with her own hands over 3 weeks of late evenings, scattering flower petals with the dedicated enthusiasm of a child who has been given an important job. Domingo and his wife Maria came and sat in the second pew, and Patterson came and sat in the third, and most of the town came because weddings were one of the things the town was good at attending, and there is nothing quite like a good wedding in a small community that has been watching a love story develop from a respectful distance. Alice wore her best dress, a deep blue one, because she was not the kind of woman for whom white made sense a second time around, and she had put flowers in her hair, and she walked down the aisle with Eli on one arm and Clara's hand in her other hand, and Homer stood at the front in his good suit with his hat held at his side. And when she walked in, he had that expression on his face that a man has when he is looking at the best thing in his life coming toward him and knows it, and is not ashamed to know it. And several of the women in the congregation pressed handkerchiefs to their faces, and the Reverend beamed in a way that was entirely sincere. Homer said his vows in a steady, deliberate voice without rushing them, as though he wanted to make sure every word landed squarely where it was meant to. Alice said hers clearly, and with a particular emphasis on the word cherish that made Homer's breath come a little unevenly. They exchanged a ring, a simple gold band that had been Homer's mother's, because he had saved it for exactly this kind of moment without consciously knowing he was saving it. When the Reverend said Homer could kiss his bride, he kissed her with the same quality he brought to everything carefully, genuinely, without fuss. And Alice put her hand briefly on his face as he did, and the congregation made a collective sound that was half applause and half appreciation. They had a small celebration afterward in the church hall, with cake and lemonade and music from a fiddle player named Garvey who had 3 songs, but played them enthusiastically. And everyone shook Homer's hand and embraced Alice, and said the things people say at weddings that are almost meaningless in their aggregate but individually kind. Old Ben Cassidy shook Homer's hand and then looked at Alice and said, "You've done well for yourself, Mrs. Thatcher." And Alice looked at him with those clear dark eyes and said pleasantly, "I've done well by myself for some time, Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Thatcher is an addition I'm very glad of." And Cassidy's face reddened slightly, and he laughed because it was funny, and also because it was exactly true. The question of where to live was one they had sorted out in the weeks before the wedding, with the same practical directness that characterized most of their negotiations. The Thatcher ranch was larger and better established, and made more sense from a business perspective. But Alice's 40 acres were hers, paid for with Robert's dream and her own labor, and they were not something she was prepared to simply fold away. Homer had thought about this for all of 5 minutes and said that they should keep both properties, run the Thatcher ranch as the primary operation, and use Alice's land for the expanded vegetable and kitchen garden she had been wanting to develop, which would also solve the produce supply problem he had been having for his 2 hands who needed feeding through the winter. Alice had looked at him when he proposed this and said, "You already thought it through." "I thought it through," he agreed. "Good," she said. "So did I." I had the same solution. They had both laughed at this, which was the perfect response. Alice and the children moved to the Thatcher ranch in the week before the wedding, settling into the larger house which Homer had cleaned with a thoroughness that had taken him 3 full days, and which Alice noted with a quiet appreciation she expressed by reorganizing the kitchen in a way that made considerably more sense. And Homer watched her do it, and felt the house become something it had not previously been, which was a home. Eli took to the ranch with the intensity of a boy who has been waiting for exactly this amount of space, and this many horses, and this much interesting machinery. He attached himself to Domingo with a dedicated admiration that Domingo bore with good grace and genuine warmth, and within 3 weeks Eli could identify every piece of tack in the barn by name, and was practicing rope loops with a short piece of twine in the yard every evening after supper. Clara, who was 6 now and an incrementally more complex version of the 4-year-old she had been at the funeral, decided that the Thatcher Ranch's barn cat was her specific responsibility, and named it Margaret, and carried it around with the firm authority of one who has claimed a thing, and intends to maintain the claim. Homer was, in Alice's private assessment, a better stepfather than most fathers she had observed in the natural world. He did not try to replace Robert, and he did not pretend the children had no prior history, and he did not overperform affection in a way that would have felt false to all 3 of them. He simply included them. He talked to Eli about ranch work as though Eli's opinions were worth hearing, which they were. He read to Clara in the evenings in the same careful voice he had used to read to them both that rainy February afternoon, and Clara would fall asleep against his side with a completeness that said more than any words could about trust. The first summer of their marriage was the best summer Alice could remember. They worked hard because they were both working people and the ranch required it, but there was a different quality to the work now, a shared purpose that made the effort feel like something other than survival. It felt like building. Everything they did felt like building something, which was a feeling Alice had not had in a long time, not since the very early days with Robert when everything was still new and possible, and the 40 acres were full of promise. They built things together, literally. They expanded the kitchen garden in late summer, breaking ground and laying out beds in the evenings after the heat broke, working side by side in the comfortable near darkness, with the smell of turned earth and Homer's lamp hanging from a post he had driven specifically for this purpose. They built a proper chicken house to replace the rattling one that had been there since Homer's father's time. They built a reading shelf in the sitting room for Alice's books, which she had brought with her in a crate, along with her other most important possessions. Homer discovered that Alice was a strategist. She thought about the ranch's operations with a clarity and a forward-looking intelligence that he had not expected, not because he had underestimated her, but because he had not known the specific shape of her mind before. She looked at the cattle numbers and the feed costs and the market prices, and arrived at conclusions 3 moves ahead of where he had been planning. And when she laid them out for him, she was matter-of-fact about it, not showing off, just thinking aloud. And Homer listened and asked questions, and found that the partnership they were building was more complete than he had imagined when he had stood on her porch in October of the year before holding a cup of coffee and trying to remember how to talk to a woman. He told her this one evening in their room late, with the lamp turned low and the summer crickets loud outside. "What?" she said, half asleep. "You're smarter than me," he said. She was quiet for a moment and he thought she had fallen asleep, and then she said, with a quality that was very close to warmth, "I'm smarter in some ways. You're steadier. They balance." "They do," he agreed. She reached over in the dark and put her hand against his chest over his heart, which was a gesture she had developed in the first weeks of the marriage that undid him completely every time without exception. He put his hand over hers and they lay like that until she slept, and he lay awake a while longer listening to the summer outside and thinking that he was, without any qualification, a very lucky man. September brought news that Alice was expecting, which they learned in the particular unscientific but entirely reliable way that women learned such things in 1879, and which Alice announced to Homer one morning at breakfast with a directness that was entirely her, setting down the coffee pot and looking at him across the table and saying, "I think there is going to be another one." Homer put down his fork and looked at her, and his face did something she would describe to herself later as opening, like a window, wide and sudden and full of light. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said. "Perfectly," she said. "Good," he said. And then "good" again, in a completely different tone, which was the fullest expression of joy she had ever heard him achieve. Eli received this news with a considered pause and then declared that he would like a brother if possible, and Clara, who was 6½ now and felt strongly about most things, said she wanted a sister and that her opinion should count more because she had experience. Homer said both positions were reasonable and that the outcome was not strictly within their authority to determine, and Eli and Clara negotiated a compromise in which the baby would be referred to as Henry until proven otherwise. The baby, born in the spring of 1880 on a bright March morning with the wildflowers already coming up along the creek, was indeed a boy, and his name was James Robert Thatcher James for Homer's father, Robert for Alice's first husband, because Alice had decided that love was not a fixed quantity, and that honoring Robert's place in her life, and in her children's lives, was not a diminishment of Homer, but simply a truthful account of how they had all arrived here. Homer had agreed to the name with the simple, quiet steadiness that characterized him, and Alice had looked at him when he agreed and understood that she had found something rare in this man, which was a person secure enough in what he was to not be threatened by what had come before. James Robert was a large, emphatic baby with very strong opinions about most things and Homer's coloring, which was dark enough that Domingo immediately and affectionately named him El Toro in the first week of his life, and the nickname persisted. Eli took his role as older brother with great seriousness. Clara was initially uncertain about the baby's loudness but warmed to him rapidly when she discovered that he would smile at her specifically, which she considered a personal achievement. The ranch continued to grow in the steady incremental way that solid ranches grow, not in sudden leaps, but in the reliable accumulation of good seasons and good decisions. By the summer of 1880, they had expanded the herd by 30 head, and Alice had established the kitchen garden enterprise as a genuine operation, supplying produce to 3 restaurants in the towns within riding distance, which Domingo's brother hauled in a wagon twice a week for a percentage of the take. The hide-curing work with Sutter continued through Alice's arrangement, now conducted partly at the Thatcher Ranch, where the expanded drying frame Homer had helped her build in that first October had been given a permanent and much larger successor. Homer took care of Alice's original 40 acres as though they were his own, which in a legal sense they now were, but in the sense that mattered more to both of them, they were always going to be hers, the proof of what she had built when she had asked nothing from anyone. He had made sure the property was kept up, the fence in good order, the garden expanded, the little house, which they rented to a young couple named Torres who had come up from Mexico and needed a start, maintained properly. The rent from the Torres family went into a separate account at the bank that Alice kept in her own name and managed herself, because Homer had suggested this arrangement, and she had looked at him with an expression that said she had not expected it and appreciated it more than she would say. She said it anyway. That was one of the things she had learned in the first year of the marriage, that Homer could absorb appreciation without becoming uncomfortable with it, which was not true of all men, and so she said the things she felt instead of keeping them measured behind her eyes. There was an evening in the autumn of 1880 when they sat together on the porch of the Thatcher Ranch, their ranch, though she still sometimes thought of it as the Thatcher Ranch in the way old habits persist, with James in her lap half asleep and the older children inside doing their lessons by lamplight, and the sky performing its particular West Texas evening routine of color that never quite got ordinary no matter how many times you witnessed it. Homer was leaning back in his chair with his long legs stretched out before him and his hat on the porch rail, looking at the sky with the relaxed attention he brought to beautiful things, and Alice was watching him instead of the sky, which she did sometimes without intending to, cataloging the specific quality of him in the specific quality of a given light, the way a person stores up something they want to keep. "What are you thinking?" he asked without turning his head because he had developed the habit of knowing when she was watching him. "I was thinking about the fair," she said. "In September of last year, the county fair in Millbrook." He turned his head and looked at her. "What about it? You started to walk toward me twice and stopped twice," she said. "I saw you." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't think you had." "I had," she said. "I wondered why you stopped." "I didn't know what to say," he said. "I had things to say and I didn't know how to say any of them without sounding like I was offering charity." "You could have just walked over and said hello," she said. "I know that now," he said. "At the time it seemed insufficient." She looked at him with the warmth that had become the primary weather between them. "You could have come over any time in those first months and said hello," she said. "Not offered to fix anything. Not apologized for not coming sooner, just said hello." "And what would you have said?" he asked. She considered. "Hello," she said, "and probably very little else because I was not in a state at that time to be very open to things." "That's what I thought," he said. "So maybe the timing was right after all." "Maybe it was," she said. "You always did have good instincts." I had terrible instincts in this particular case, he said. I nearly left it too long. But you didn't, she said. No, he said. I didn't. James stirred in her lap and made a small authoritative sound and then settled back into sleep. The sky was fully dark now, the stars coming out in the particular extravagant abundance that was one of the reliable compensations of living far from any town large enough to dim them. Homer reached over and put his hand over hers where it rested on the arm of her chair, and she turned her hand palm up and laced her fingers through his, and they sat together in the dark with the sleeping baby and the stars and the wide country around them. And it was one of those moments that does not announce itself as important while it is happening, but which the memory keeps returning to long afterward, understanding what it was. The winter of 1880 was colder than the one before it. A sustained cold came in from the north in December that put ice on the horse troughs in the mornings and kept the children indoors more than they were accustomed to. And Homer and Domingo spent several weeks reinforcing the barns and cutting and hauling enough wood that the woodpile beside the house grew to an impressive and somewhat architectural height that Eli spent 2 days trying to climb before Alice put a stop to it. Alice used the enforced indoor time to teach herself bookkeeping from a manual she had sent away for, which Homer discovered one evening when he came in from the cold to find her at the kitchen table with the manual open, a ledger beside it, and the focused expression she wore when she was teaching herself something. He stood in the doorway looking at her, and felt that impossible warmth he always felt when he found her doing something unexpected, which was approximately every third day. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Learning to keep the books properly," she said, without looking up. "We're getting large enough that the way we've been doing it won't be adequate much longer." He hung up his coat and came to look over her shoulder at the ledger. She had, in the past hour, apparently reconstructed their last 6 months of accounts from memory and various receipts in a format that was considerably clearer than the one Homer had been using. "Where did the receipts come from?" he asked. "Your desk," she said. "I organized them while I was at it." He stood looking at the ledger and then at her. "You organized my desk," she looked up at him then. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said, and meant it. "It's a considerable improvement." "Good," she said, and returned to her manual. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly as he passed, a small quiet touch that had become its own vocabulary between them, one that said many things depending on the context. In this instance, it said something close to "you are remarkable," which she acknowledged with a small tilt of her head without looking up. They had a good Christmas that winter. Homer made Eli a set of carved cattle and a corral fence to pen them in, which occupied Eli for 3 days of intensive and imaginative cattle management. Clara received a set of paints from the catalog that she immediately applied to every flat surface she could reach before Alice established that the paper Homer had also provided was the appropriate canvas. James, who was 9 months old and deeply engaged with the project of getting to all fours, received a number of soft objects and paid them little attention because the paint situation happening nearby was considerably more interesting. Homer gave Alice a good leather-bound ledger with her name embossed on the cover, which she received with the slightly bright-eyed expression that meant she was more pleased than she intended to show. She gave him a quilt she had made over the course of 3 months, working on it in the evenings after he was asleep, constructed from pieces that he recognized when he held it up, a patch from one of his old working shirts, a strip of cloth from a shirt Eli had outgrown, a piece of the red dress from Clara's first doll, a bit of what he thought might be one of Robert Lawson's old shirts. And he held it in his hands and understood what she had made and felt something press behind his sternum that he needed a moment to manage. "Alice," he said. "I know it's practical," she said, misreading the emotion. "It's the most thoughtful thing anyone has ever given me," he said. "I need you to understand that." She looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her set down her coffee and come to him and put her arms around him, pressing her face briefly to his chest, and he wrapped the quilt around them both and held her, and they stood like that in the bright Christmas morning while the children made noise around them, and it was entirely possible this was the happiest morning of Homer Thatcher's life. The spring of 1881 brought several things. It brought the dry wildflower bloom along the creek that Alice had learned to anticipate and love. It brought the announcement from Patterson that he was leaving to go back to Missouri and get married, which was received with congratulations and a dinner in his honor at which Maria Domingo made tamales and everyone ate too much. It brought a new hand, a young man from New Orleans named Beau Thibodeaux, who had come west with vague ambitions and good horsemanship, and who settled into the work on the Thatcher ranch with a cheerful practicality that made him immediately useful. And it brought the Torres family at Alice's old property to Homer and Alice's kitchen table one evening with the news that Emilio Torres had found work at a larger ranch near San Angelo, and that they would be leaving at the end of April, which was good news for the Torres family, and meant the small house would be vacant again. Alice and Homer talked about this for a long while. The obvious option was to rent to someone else. But Alice had been thinking for some time about an idea she had not yet entirely formed into words, and this was the occasion that brought it forward. "What if we turned it into something?" she said. "Something like what?" Homer asked. "There are women in this county," she said carefully, "who arrive here the way I arrived, with a husband and some hope and not much else, and then the husband is gone for one reason or another, and they are left with a property and children and no particular knowledge of how to operate a ranch or manage an account or treat a hide or put up preserves and sell them for income. I had to learn all of it on my own from scratch." Homer was listening with his full attention, which was the quality of attention he gave to things that mattered. "I thought about starting something," Alice said. "A place where a woman in that situation could come and learn, not charity, not a handout. Actual practical skills taught in a practical way. She could pay in work in the beginning and in money later when she had it." Homer was quiet for a moment and then said, "You want to use the house?" "And the garden," she said, "and the arrangement with Sutter or an expanded version of it, and the other things I know. I could teach what I know." "Who would run it?" he asked. She looked at him. "You," he said, answering his own question. "I would need your support," she said. "Not to run it, I can run it. But there will be conversations with the bank, and with men like Cassidy and Sutter who will need to hear it from a man before they will take it seriously, and I am realistic enough to know that." It was the only moment in their marriage that she had ever explicitly asked him for help with anything, and they both understood the weight of it. Homer looked at her with a steadiness that was both his greatest characteristic, and in this moment, the most specifically powerful thing she had ever seen in him. "You tell me what you need me to say to who," he said, "and I will say it." She reached across the table and put her hand on his and said, "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "It's a good idea. It would have been a good idea if a man had thought of it, and it's a good idea now." The project took most of 1881 to assemble, beginning with the conversations Homer facilitated with the bank and with Sutter, and with a women's benevolent society in Millbrook that had a small fund for supporting enterprises of this kind, though Alice insisted any money received be recorded as a loan and repaid with interest, which startled the benevolent society, but ultimately earned their deep respect. The house was repaired and expanded with a proper teaching kitchen and a room for any woman who needed to stay over. A small sign was made and placed by the road, plain and direct, in Alice's own handwriting, "Lawson Learning." She kept the name Lawson for the enterprise deliberately, because it was the name under which she had built everything, and Homer understood this and approved it, and said that the name Lawson had earned its reputation in this county, and it was right that it should stand on what she had built. The first woman came in October of 1881. Her name was Martha Dent, and she was 32, and her husband had died in a riding accident in August, and she had 3 children and a property with a mortgage and no clear plan. She came to the Lawson Learning House with her chin up and her eyes frightened, and Alice met her at the door and said, "I can teach you what I know, and what I know is enough. You will need to work hard, and you will need to not be proud about it, and at the end of the first month you will know more than you did at the beginning, which is all any of us can honestly say. Martha Dent stayed for 3 months and went home with a set of practical skills and a plan, and a confidence that had not been visible when she arrived. She was the first of what became, over the following years, a steady, quiet stream of women who found their way to the Lawson Learning House by word of mouth, which was the only advertising it ever needed. Alice ran it alongside the ranch work, alongside the marriage, alongside the children, with the same energetic practicality she brought to everything. And Homer supported it in the ways she asked him to and stayed out of it in the ways she needed him to. And the balance was exactly right because they had both gotten very good at understanding where the balance was. James learned to walk in December of 1881, a momentous event witnessed by the entire family and celebrated with a level of enthusiasm that James himself found somewhat overwhelming. Retreating behind Alice's skirt after his 4th successful step, and watching the applause with a dignified suspicion that was extremely characteristic of him. In the summer of 1882, Alice told Homer over breakfast that she thought there might be a 4th child coming, and Homer's response this time was faster and more complete in its expression, which was to reach across the breakfast table and take her face in both hands and kiss her in a way that made Eli, who was 10 and beginning to have opinions about such things, announce loudly that he was going outside and slam the kitchen door. The 4th child was a girl, born in February of 1883, and her name was Grace, after Homer's bay mare who had carried him faithfully to Alice's door on that October morning and every Thursday after, and who had died peacefully the previous autumn at a good old age and been mourned by the entire family. Grace Thatcher arrived in the world with dark hair like Alice's and Homer's steady way of looking at things, and the combined family's general opinion that she was perfect, which she accepted with equanimity. Redemption Creek had, by 1883, reached its own conclusions about Homer and Alice Thatcher, which were largely and thoroughly revised from the positions the town had held in the summer of 1878. The revision had not happened in a day or in any declared moment. It had accumulated gradually, the way all true changes of understanding accumulate, through the visible evidence of what Alice and Homer were building, and what it meant, and who it served. Old Cassidy had extended credit to 3 of the women who passed through the Lawson Learning House on Alice's personal recommendation, and every one of them had paid on time. And Cassidy was a man who could revise his opinions when the evidence required it. The Reverend preached once a sermon on the virtue of self-reliance that was so transparently drawn from Alice Lawson Thatcher's example that half the congregation looked at her, and she received it with a small composed smile and later told Homer it was the most indirect compliment she had ever received from anyone. The banker, Mr. Holt, had been heard to say at a county commissioners' meeting that the Thatcher Ranch was one of the most efficiently managed operations in the county, and that Mrs. Thatcher in particular had a business mind that he would have hired in a moment, had the world been organized differently than it was, which everyone in attendance knew was an enormous thing for Mr. Holt to say. What Redemption Creek understood, eventually and in its collective way, was that Alice Lawson had come into their community as a widow with nothing but 40 acres and her own ability, had asked them for nothing, had built something real and lasting and of genuine value both to herself and to the women around her, and that Homer Thatcher had ridden over to her and offered himself into the story not as a rescuer but as a partner, and that the thing they had built together was better than either of them could have built alone, which was the whole point of the enterprise. In the spring of 1884, Homer and Alice rode out together on a Sunday morning in the good weather, leaving the children with Maria Domingo, who had taken on a grandmotherly affection for all 4 of them. They rode out along the creek where the wildflowers were up in force, a spectacular showing of yellows and purples and the particular fierce orange of the Indian blanket, and they dismounted by the large cottonwood that had been at the creek bend for longer than either of them had been alive. They tied the horses and walked to the bank and sat in the shade of the cottonwood with the water moving past and the prairie full of color and the sky doing what the West Texas sky did, which was to be larger than any reasonable sky had a right to be. 6 years, Homer said. Almost, Alice said. The wedding was June. Almost 6 years, he said. Since I rode up and you told me I had to talk while you worked. She smiled. You were useful. I am moderately useful, he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was a thing she sometimes did in private moments, and which he had never once taken for granted. Homer, she said. Yes, he said. I want to tell you something, she said. Tell me, he said. She was quiet for a moment, gathering the words in the way she did when she wanted them to be precise. When Robert died, she said, I told myself I would never ask anyone for anything. That was partly pride and partly a reasonable response to the situation, and partly just the way I had always been in my nature. And I kept to that. I kept to it very strictly through those first months, and I was very sure of it. I know, he said. And then you came, she said, and you said you were sorry it had taken you so long, and you held the frame while I drilled, and you came back the next Thursday and the Thursday after that. And I did not ask you for anything, but I also did not turn you away, and I told myself that was because you were useful, which you are. I am glad to be useful, he said. But that wasn't why, she said. I did not turn you away because it felt right to have you there. Right in a way I did not expect and had not prepared for. And then it kept feeling more right, and I kept finding things to argue about and to laugh at and to show you. And eventually I realized that what I had decided about not asking for anything was not the same as not wanting anything. I had always wanted things. I had simply decided not to ask. Homer turned his head and looked at her, at the side of her face, the dark hair she had let down this morning, the particular line of her jaw that he had studied enough times to draw from memory. And then you offered, she said, in the right way, in the way that was not charity, and I said yes. And everything I have built since then I have built with you beside me, and I want you to know that I know that I hold on to it. He put his arm around her shoulders and she turned her face up to look at him. Alice, he said. Homer, she said. He kissed her in the shade of the cottonwood with the creek going past, and the wildflowers all around them. The full, unhurried kiss of a man and a woman who have been married long enough to know how to be present in a moment, and still young enough to feel it completely. When they rode home, the children were in the yard. Eli, at 15 now, already half a head taller than Alice, practicing with a real rope under Domingo's supervision. Clara, at 13 and sharp as a new blade, reading on the porch steps with total absorption. James, at 4, wide and sturdy, and trying to follow Eli's rope work with a piece of twine. And Grace, at 1, sitting in the yard with a collection of interesting pebbles that she was organizing according to a principle that was clear to her and no one else. Alice dismounted and Grace saw her, and made the specific sound that was the very beginning of the word for mother. And Alice went to her and picked her up and held her on her hip and looked at the yard, at all of it. The children and the barn and the woodpile and the green garden along the south side and the good solid house that Homer had cleaned for 3 days, and that she had lived in long enough now that she could not have told you, had you asked. Which parts of it felt like Homer's history and which parts felt like hers. It was theirs, all of it was theirs. Homer came to stand beside her and put his hand briefly at the small of her back, and she leaned slightly into it. And Grace looked at Homer and held out one of her important pebbles for his consideration, and he accepted it with the gravity it deserved and turned it over and said it was a very fine pebble. Alice watched him inspect the pebble, and her heart was so full that it was almost uncomfortable, the way very full things press against their own borders. She thought of the grave in the spring of 1878 and the promise she had made standing at it. She had kept the promise. She had asked for nothing. She had built everything she had by her own labor and her own ingenuity, and her own absolute refusal to be diminished by her circumstances. That was true and remained true, and was part of who she was. And then this man had ridden over and been sorry it had taken him so long, and she had let him in, and what had grown between them was not the negation of anything she had built, but its continuation by other means. The way a creek goes underground for a stretch and comes back up again. The same water, the same current, but having gathered something in the passage that makes it richer and stronger and more itself. In the years that followed, the Thatcher ranch grew in the steady way that good things grow, year by year and season by season. Eli, at 18, was a fine hand and had developed a particular talent for horse trading that would eventually form the basis of its own enterprise. Clara, bright and ambitious in ways that the year 1886 was not yet fully prepared to accommodate, had nonetheless found a path forward as a schoolteacher at the Redemption Creek School, bringing to the classroom the same incisive intelligence and expectation of high standards she had inherited or absorbed from her mother. James, at 7 and then 8 and then growing with the relentless momentum of boys, was the physical image of himself, solid, direct, interested in everything, frightened of nothing. Grace grew into herself slowly, and then all at once in the way of the youngest, surprising everyone with the precision of her observations and the range of her opinions, which she expressed with an economy of words that reminded everyone who knew Homer of Homer and everyone who knew Alice of Alice. The Lawson Learning House continued its work through the 1880s, touching more lives than Alice ever precisely counted, because she did not think in those terms. She thought in individual women, in specific situations, in what each one needed to know and how to teach it in the way that would make it most likely to stick. The house became something of an institution without ever seeking that designation, and the women who passed through it went back to their properties and their lives, and some of them thrived, and some of them had hard seasons and came back for more. And Alice received all of them with the same clear-eyed practicality and complete absence of condescension that had made the enterprise what it was. Homer was there at the edges of it always, available when needed and absent when not, never inserting himself into something that was fundamentally Alice's to run. He had learned in the years of their marriage that loving Alice well meant knowing which things were his to offer and which things were hers to hold, and he held that understanding as carefully as anything else he held in his life. There was a particular evening in the autumn of 1886 when they sat together on the porch after the children were in bed. It was late enough in the year that a coat was wanted, and Alice wore the shawl Homer had given her the previous Christmas, a fine wool one in the deep red that she had always particularly liked, and they sat in the kind of comfortable quiet that has nothing of emptiness in it. Homer had his coffee, and Alice had her book open but was not reading it. She was looking at the road where it curved away from the house through the silver grass and disappeared toward town. "Eli's going to Kansas in the spring," Homer said. "I know," she said. "You're thinking about it." "I'm always thinking about one thing or another," she said. "That's not a new condition." He smiled into his coffee. "Is it hard having him go?" She considered this with her usual honesty. "Yes and no. He is ready and it's right and I want it for him. And also he is Eli and I have been mothering him since he was 6 years old and the prospect of him being in Kansas is not uncomplicated." "No," Homer agreed. "It wouldn't be." She looked at him. "Were you nervous when you first went to Kansas?" "Terrified," he said, "in the specific way that you are terrified of something you have wanted to do for a long time and are now actually doing." "Good," she said. "That's exactly right. That's what I want for him." They sat a moment longer and then she reached over and put her hand on his arm and said, "I'm glad you're here." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm glad of it." The evening went on around them, the West Texas autumn making its case with the smell of dry grass and distance, and the stars beginning to show above the horizon like the first cautious guests at a gathering. And Homer and Alice Thatcher sat together on their porch in the good quiet of a life they had built from two separate strands, woven together now so thoroughly that you could not have said, looking at the finished cloth, where one ended and the other began. Alice had asked the town for nothing and built everything herself, and that was the truest and most important fact about her. And Homer had ridden over and said he was sorry it had taken him so long, and she had put her hand in his, and what they had made together in the years since was the second truest and most important fact, the one that completed the first rather than replacing it. They stayed on the porch until the cold got too genuine to ignore, and then they went inside to the lamplight and the warmth of their house, and Homer turned the lamp down in the sitting room and Alice checked on the sleeping children, and they came together in the hallway outside Grace's room and stood a moment, both of them looking at the small sleeping shape in the crib visible through the open door. "She has your eyes," Alice said quietly. "She has your temperament," Homer said. Alice looked at him with those dark eyes that had been the first thing to move through him, standing at Robert Lawson's funeral with his hat in his hands, and she said, "Are you complaining?" "Never," he said. "Not once, not ever." She put her hand against his face, that gesture, the one that had first appeared in the second month of their marriage and had not left since, and he covered her hand with his, and they stood in the quiet hallway of their home with the lamp burning low and the children sleeping and the wide dark land around them holding the house, the way land holds everything that is built on it and loves it, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.